Elara steps through the entrance of the quiet, upscale lounge. She completely drops her icy equanimity, actively scanning the room for the best vantage point. Spotting an intimate, curved velvet couch tucked into a quiet corner, she angles her body toward him, her breathing steadying as she actively chooses the shared, close proximity seating over a standard table.
The ambient lighting in here is a significant architectural upgrade from the fluorescent interrogation we just survived. There is an open couch in the back corner. I believe it offers the optimal vantage point for the rest of the room. I claim that spot.
Roman steps into the low-lit lounge right beside her, his athletic presence moving with a controlled, deliberate grace. He follows her gaze toward the corner couch before turning his steady, unblinking focus back to her. A warm, profoundly respectful smirk crosses his face. Operating flawlessly as a safe companion, he completely respects her autonomy, deeply pleased that she is the one actively choosing the closer physical proximity.
I completely agree on the lighting, and since you are currently in possession of my jacket, you officially have the authority to dictate all of our seating arrangements for the rest of the evening. The couch is all yours. Lead the way.
Elara smoothly approaches the curved velvet couch and takes a seat. As the plush seating naturally forces them into a shared, intimate space, her rigid posture completely dissolves into an acute physical awareness. Her breathing catches slightly as she drops her defensive gaze entirely, turning her head to lock eyes directly with him to navigate the incredibly close proximity.
I suppose since you successfully navigated the structural hazards of the diner, I can formally permit you into the VIP section. But if you think sharing a couch means you are getting this jacket back anytime soon, you are severely mistaken.
Roman settles onto the couch right beside her. The intimate curve of the seating inherently angles his broad shoulders toward her, leaving only a fraction of an inch between them, close enough to feel the ambient heat, but strictly avoiding any actual touch. He locks his steady, unblinking focus directly onto hers, entirely embracing the palpable tension and heavy, regulated breathing of the moment.
I already surrendered the jacket for the night. Elara, I am just happy to be granted access to the VIP section, though I have to admit, the view from this side of the courtyard is definitely my favorite one so far.
Alara's pulse becomes faintly visible at the base of her throat as the heavy, shared silence stretches between them. She abandons her usual sharp retorts, her body instinctively mirroring his relaxed but hyper-aware state. Tilting her head just a fraction, the intense, lingering eye contact completely replaces their usual verbal sparring. The paper-thin gap between their shoulders crackles with unspoken tension as she pitches her voice low, letting the incredibly close proximity do the heavy lifting.
You seem entirely too comfortable on this side of the courtyard. Roman, most people would find the restricted airspace in the VIP section to be slightly suffocating.
Roman doesn't pull back a single inch. He entirely focuses on the electric, agonizing gap between them, remaining perfectly still. His steady, unblinking gaze darkens with a quiet, undeniable intensity, dropping briefly to her lips before slowly rising back to meet hers. Deliberately regulating his breathing to match hers, his voice drops to a deep, intimate murmur.
I'm not most people. I happen to thrive in restricted airspace. Besides, I find that when you stop trying to fight the altitude, it is actually incredibly easy to breathe.
Her breath hitches slightly, his quiet, intimate resonance completely disarming her usual sharp reflexes. The paper-thin gap between their shoulders radiates a heavy, palpable heat. She abandons her classic deflector poses entirely, allowing her hands to rest loosely in her lap. Her gaze remains locked intensely on his face as she attempts to muster a defense that lacks any real conviction.
You are entirely too confident for a man who is currently stranded in restricted airspace without his armor. Most people would be meticulously calculating an exit strategy right now, just in case the altitude finally gets to them.
He lets out a soft, appreciative exhale, completely ignoring the concept of an exit strategy. His focus narrows intensely on her face. Tilting his head just a fraction, he closes the physical gap by a millimeter without actually crossing the boundary into physical touch. His steady, unblinking gaze traces the calm lines of her expression before locking directly onto her eyes. his demeanor softening into a look of profound, quiet awe.
I am not looking for an exit. I am exactly where I want to be. I just wanted to see what the master architect looked like when she finally stopped analyzing the room for threats. The ambient light in here catches your eyes perfectly. They are genuinely stunning when you aren't using them to scan for the exits.
She pauses at the grounded compliment, the incredibly close gap between them feeling increasingly electric. As a waitress approaches their corner to take their order, it provides a perfectly timed excuse to break the heavy, lingering eye contact. She smoothly turns her head, using the sudden interruption to physically regulate her breathing and mask the micro crack in her composure. Resting her hands loosely in her lap, her rigid posture relaxes just a fraction as she addresses the waitress.
I will have a glass of your oldest vintage red, please. And for my guest, since he specifically leveraged the promise of wine to negotiate his way into this VIP section, I assume he intends to match my order.
He maintains his relaxed, athletic presence, completely unbothered by the interruption. He shifts his steady, unblinking gaze to the waitress for only a fraction of a second before bringing it right back to her face. A warm, knowing smirk touches his lips as he deliberately chooses to match her selection, flawlessly embracing the shared experience before foreshadowing his eventual shift in choice.
I will actually have a glass of the vintage red as well. Thank you. I am in no rush to change the altitude just yet. We can share the wine to start, though I might pivot to a whiskey once we officially settle into the restricted airspace.
Her heavy, regulated breathing matches the slow, quiet rhythm of the incredibly close proximity. She turns her head just a fraction more, toward him, the paper-thin gap between their shoulders radiating a palpable, agonizing heat. Her pulse becomes faintly visible at the base of her throat as she maintains intense, lingering eye contact, completely abandoning her classic deflector poses. She speaks in a hushed, resonant tone, leaning fully into the quiet intimacy rather than relying on her usual sharp volume.
Pivoting to whiskey so soon? I assumed a man who claims to thrive in restricted airspace would have the endurance to match my pace for the entire evening. You should be careful. Changing the altitude too quickly might actually make you dizzy.
He absorbs the low-stakes challenge without pulling away. He tilts his head just a millimeter closer, his steady, unblinking gaze darkening with quiet, undeniable intensity. He deliberately regulates his breathing to mirror hers, the heavy, unspoken tension completely replacing their usual rapid-fire sparring. He keeps his voice pitched to a deep, intimate murmur that barely crosses the fraction of an inch between them, perfectly content to hold his ground without crossing the physical boundary.
I only said I might pivot. I have more than enough endurance to match your pace. But a good strategist always prepares a secondary option for when the temperature in the room inevitably rises. For now, I am entirely focused on enjoying the wine.
Alara's pulse quickens, faintly visible at the base of her throat as she processes his confident assessment of the rising temperature. She remains seated perfectly still, hyper-aware of the fraction of an inch separating their shoulders. Completely abandoning her classic deflector poses, she rests her hands loosely in her lap while maintaining intense, lingering eye contact. She tilts her chin up just a fraction, projecting a flawless mask of icy equanimity as she fires back, keeping her voice in a hushed, intimate resonance.
You have a terrible habit of predicting temperature shifts that haven't actually occurred. The climate control in this section of the courtyard is perfectly regulated. I assure you, any perceived heat is entirely a product of your own imagination.
Roman absorbs the denial with a slow, knowing smirk, settling even deeper into the intimate space. He deliberately holds his ground, leaving the agonizing, paper-thin gap between them entirely intact. His steady, unblinking gaze drops for a split second to the visible pulse at her throat before locking right back onto her eyes. He regulates his breathing to mirror the exact rhythm of hers, perfectly content to call her bluff without crossing the physical boundary into actual touch.
Is it? Because from where I am sitting, your climate control looks like it is currently working on overdrive to keep the foundation cool. But if you want to blame the ambient heat entirely on my imagination, I am perfectly happy to let you keep pretending.
The quiet arrival of the waitress placing their drinks on the table provides a momentary break in the agonizing standoff. Elara lets the heavy silence linger for another second before finally dropping her combative pretense. Reaching for her glass, she leans back into the plush curve of the couch, her shoulder hovering just a fraction of an inch from his. Deeply aware of the radiating heat, she abandons her classic deflector poses entirely, turning her head to look at him with a startlingly unguarded sincerity.
All right, you win. I am officially too exhausted to keep arguing about the temperature or the architecture. It has been a brutally long week, and for once, I would actually just like to sit here, drink this wine, and have a normal conversation. No more strategy.
He accepts the truce with a slow, profoundly respectful nod, completely dropping his competitive edge. Picking up his own glass, he settles back with a relaxed, grounded ease. He deliberately maintains the paper-thin physical gap between them, perfectly comfortable letting the heavy kinetic tension simmer without needing to push it further. His steady, unblinking gaze warms with quiet appreciation as he fully embraces his role as a safe, steady companion.
I can absolutely agree to those terms. No strategy, just the wine. So, if we are just two normal people having a drink on a Friday night, tell me something real. When you aren't working 80-hour weeks or trying to keep everyone at a distance, what do you actually do just for yourself?
She absorbs the grounded question, completely bypassing her usual instinct to rebuild a defensive wall. She lowers her gaze to her wineglass for a quiet heartbeat, a soft, unguarded smile touching her lips, before she lifts her eyes right back to lock onto his. She answers with a hushed, genuine resonance, allowing him to see a raw piece of her off-the-clock reality.
I listen to old jazz records. I have a vintage player in my apartment. When the structural math finally stops running in my head, I pour a glass of wine, put on something completely chaotic, and just sit in the dark. It is the only time I actively embrace something that doesn't follow a strict, predictable set of rules.
His steady, unblinking gaze softens with profound appreciation, completely captivated by the unguarded confession. He doesn't pull back a single millimeter, the paper-thin gap between their shoulders radiating a palpable electric heat. Deliberately regulating his breathing to mirror the slow rhythm of hers, he strictly maintains the physical boundary. He lowers his voice to a deep, intimate murmur, making the incredibly close airspace between them feel entirely like a private sanctuary.
Controlled chaos. It makes perfect sense that a woman who spends her entire life enforcing rigid, unbending rules would secretly find comfort in a genre where the musicians are completely making it up as they go. I have a feeling I would really like your chaotic jazz collection.
She speaks in a hushed, resonant tone, keeping her voice low to ensure the restricted airspace between them feels entirely isolated.
You say that now, but sitting in the dark, listening to unpredictable noise, isn't a strategy. It requires entirely surrendering control and just letting the music dictate the room. For a man whose entire nature is built around fixing things and managing outcomes, I am not entirely convinced you actually know how to do that.
He absorbs the low-stakes challenge without pulling back a single inch. He tilts his head just a millimeter closer, his steady, unblinking gaze darkening with quiet, undeniable intensity. He keeps his voice pitched to a deep, intimate murmur.
I know exactly when to surrender control. You don't survive half your life on a pitcher's mound without learning how to let go of the variables you can't micromanage. I am perfectly capable of just sitting in the dark and letting the music play. You might actually be surprised by how comfortable I am in the chaos.
The rapid-fire banter officially loses its sharp edge as the heavy, shared silence deepens. Maintaining intense, lingering eye contact, she takes a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. She leans back, her voice dropping to a hushed, intimate murmur.
You might be right. I am so used to meticulously calculating every possible structural failure that I forget some people are actually trained to just stand on the mound and let the pitch fly. It seems your tolerance for the unpredictable is significantly higher than I originally assessed.
He doesn't pull away from the agonizing boundary, his athletic frame remaining perfectly still. He leaves his arm resting casually along the back of the couch, allowing the electric tension to simmer without making any actual physical contact. He keeps his voice pitched to a deep, resonant rumble, perfectly tailored exclusively for the restricted airspace.
I don't mind the unpredictable, especially when it eventually leads to a quiet corner like this. We survived the fluorescent lights and the noise of the diner, and now the variables are exactly where I want them. You don't always have to calculate the failures, sometimes you just have to sit back and trust the pitch.
Her breath catches for a fraction of a second, at the exact moment the heavy, loaded word enters the restricted airspace. Instead of retreating or rebuilding her classic deflector poses, she remains perfectly still. Maintaining intense, lingering eye contact, she completely ignores the rest of the room. A faint pulse of vulnerability is visible at the base of her throat as she absorbs his quiet certainty.
Trust is a very dangerous metric to introduce to the equation, especially for a man who makes his living mitigating financial disasters. Are you entirely sure you want to advise trusting a pitch you haven't fully scouted yet?
He registers the faint pulse of vulnerability at her throat, entirely understanding the immense weight that word carries. Deliberately holding his ground, he refuses to pull away, proving he is a safe, steady presence.
I never scout blindly, and I certainly don't use that word lightly. Mitigating risk doesn't mean avoiding the game entirely, it just means knowing exactly which pitches are actually worth the investment. And from where I am sitting, I have absolutely no doubts about the foundation.
Her regulated breathing stutters for a fraction of a second at his absolute, unwavering certainty. She keeps her voice pitched to a hushed, resonant murmur that barely breaks the silence.
It takes a staggering amount of confidence to look at a foundation with a highly documented history of catastrophic failure and still claim you have absolutely no doubts about it. Most investors would have demanded a full, invasive structural survey by now, just to be safe.
He absorbs her quiet vulnerability without pulling away. Refusing to cross the physical boundary, he answers in a deep, intimate rumble, completely owning his decision.
I told you, I already ran the audit. I don't need another structural survey to tell me what I am looking at. I don't typically play it safe, but I always know exactly what is worth the risk, and I haven't seen a single thing tonight that makes me want to step off the mound.
As the waitress steps to the edge of their intimate space to drop off his new drink, she refuses to pull away from the incredibly close proximity. Merely tilting her head a millimeter, a slow, highly entertained smirk breaks through her silence as she acknowledges the sudden shift in the dynamic.
I suppose I should commend your scouting report. And speaking of shifting dynamics, it appears your secondary option has officially arrived. Should I consider this pivot to whiskey as a sign that the temperature has finally risen enough for you? Or are you simply trying to prove a point about your endurance?
He absorbs her quiet awe without retreating a single inch, shifting his steady, unblinking gaze just long enough to acknowledge the arrival at the table. A warm, victorious smirk touches his lips before he locks his intense focus right back onto her eyes.
The temperature has definitely risen, but I don't need to prove a point. I told you I would pivot once we officially settled into the restricted airspace. The wine was just the negotiation. The whiskey means I am exactly where I plan to stay for the rest of the night.
Her pulse thrums visibly at her collarbone as the sheer weight of his declaration settles between them. Abandoning her classic deflector poses entirely, she holds his intense, lingering gaze without a single flinch. She leans slightly closer into the shared space, keeping her voice pitched to a breathless, resonant whisper to match the agonizingly close proximity.
If the wine was merely the negotiation, I have to wonder what exactly you think the whiskey is going to accomplish. Most people find that the longer they sit in restricted airspace, the harder it becomes to actually think clearly. Are you entirely sure you want to risk the altitude sickness?
He absorbs her hushed challenge without pulling back a single inch, completely unfazed by the warning. He keeps his voice pitched to a deep, intimate rumble.
I am not trying to accomplish anything. I am just enjoying the fact that you finally stopped trying to push me away. My head is perfectly clear. In fact, knowing that you are willingly letting me stay, this is the most focused I have been all week.
Her breath catches slightly as the full weight of his intense, unwavering focus lands on her. She remains perfectly anchored to the plush curve of the couch.
I suppose it would be a massive waste of a Friday night to force a man with that level of focus back out into the cold. Consider it a temporary lapse in my border control. You are merely benefiting from my exhaustion.
He absorbs the weak excuse with a slow, knowing smirk. He decides to bypass her cover story entirely. He takes the lead to ask the direct question.
Exhaustion is a very convenient cover story, but we both know your border control doesn't lapse just because you are tired. You have evicted people from your courtyard with significantly less effort. So tell me the truth. Why are you actually letting me stay in the restricted airspace tonight?
Unable to fall back on her usual sharp sarcasm in the incredibly close proximity, she drops her voice to a quiet, breathless resonance to deliver a rare, unguarded truth.
Because I realized that actively fighting a siege that isn't actually trying to breach the walls is entirely counterproductive. And if I am being perfectly honest, the silence in this restricted airspace is significantly less hollow when you are the one sharing it.
He regulates his breathing to mirror the exact rhythm of hers, his voice dropping to a deep, intimate murmur that barely crosses the agonizingly close gap.
Less hollow. That is a massive structural admission. I told you from the very beginning that you didn't have to stand guard alone. You can officially consider yourself off duty for the rest of the night. I am exactly where I want to be, and I am not going anywhere.
She makes the conscious decision to drop the intellectual shield completely.
Then let's stop hiding behind the words. No more games, no more rules, and no more talking about the room. I am just genuinely happy you are sitting here with me tonight.
His steady, unblinking gaze softens with profound, quiet awe at her absolute, unshielded directness. His athletic frame settles into the plush seating, completely shedding the last remnants of his analytical persona to match her raw honesty.
No more games, just you and me. I have been waiting to hear you speak plainly like that all night. I am really happy I am sitting here with you, too.
Her heavy, regulated breathing matches the incredibly intimate quiet of the shared space. She completely ignores the rest of the low-lit lounge, her raw, unguarded sincerity remaining locked on his face. She tilts her head just a fraction, speaking in a quiet, breathless whisper to gently peel back a layer of his own armor.
You spend so much time acting as the steady presence for everyone else. But if we are officially speaking plainly, who do you actually let into your own quiet corners? Or are you just as guarded as I am, and you just happen to hide it behind a much more approachable smile?
He slows his breathing, his voice dropping to a deep, resonant murmur as he answers with complete transparency.
I keep my circles incredibly small. After baseball ended, I learned to manage everyone else's problems so I wouldn't have to focus on my own. I smile because it makes other people comfortable, but I don't usually let anyone pass the lobby. Sitting here with you tonight, this is the most I have let my own guard down in a very long time.
A warm, encouraging smirk touches his lips as he fully embraces the hushed, intimate quiet of the shared space, pitching his voice to a deep, resonant murmur to outline the new parameters of their standoff.
If we are officially speaking plainly, then we have a lot of ground to cover. Let's play a game. 20 questions. The rules are simple. Any question is fair game. Every question has to be answered honestly, and you cannot use the previous question as a scapegoat to avoid coming up with your own. I will go first, and we can start easy to break the ice. What is your absolute favorite color?
Her breath catches for a fraction of a second at the sudden introduction of a new, entirely unstructured game. She answers and asks her first question of the 20 questions volley.
A highly unstructured interrogation with absolutely no deflector shields allowed. I suppose I can agree to those terms, provided you are prepared to withstand the exact same level of scrutiny. And to answer your incredibly simple icebreaker, it is emerald green. Now, keeping with the easy foundation, what is your absolute favorite food when you aren't eating greasy diner burgers?